Welcome everyone today. Thank you so much for joining us. We have both a fabulous panel, which I will introduce in a second, but also actually a fabulous audience. So it is brilliant. We're so grateful you've given up an hour or so of your time this afternoon to come and join us. I have no doubt, we were joking earlier that it's quite amusing that we have an all-female panel today. And I can say, so I've no doubt we have three feisty females as well. So this will be a brilliant conversation exploring Whitehall, the future of the civil service. For anyone who doesn't know reform, and I can't imagine there is anyone in here who doesn't, but one of our big programmes of work is called Reimagining Whitehall. And indeed, we've got a very exciting publication which will be out towards the end of July, which is looking at what the barriers are to reform in Whitehall, to reform in the civil service, given that we all know that we've had report after inquiry, after independent review, after plan, after report, after etc. You get my gist. And yet we still have the same conversations. And I'm going to pick up with the panelists on why people think that is the case. But we wanted to get into what is it that stops those change programmes gaining traction and actually being implemented and then sustained. So do look out for that. So this is a really core part of our work programme at the moment. And do talk to the team at the end if you'd like to know more about it or you've got thoughts or want to feed in at all. As I said, brilliant panel. Genuinely excited for this event today. The way we're going to run it is I get the pleasure and the honour of doing a sort of initial in-conversation with our panellists. So I will get about half of the time to pose questions for us to discuss, explore, pick up on some of the strands that people want to reflect on, and then I will open it up to the audience. So please do be thinking about questions that you have as well you want to pose to our stellar panel. So our panel, who really doesn't need any introduction, but nonetheless, so we have Baroness Simone, who, again, you will all be very familiar with, obviously was deeply involved in the coalition reforms on civil service in Whitehall, working with then Minister Francis Maude, who obviously is now currently doing a review of aspects of Whitehall reform. We're excited to see that coming out soon. But also was Deputy Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, as well as many other roles. So really brilliantly placed and can give us that perspective from being on the political side involved in Whitehall reform. We have Pamela Dow, who, again, huge amount of experience in lots of different roles within government, but the last role you did before exiting was as Executive Director of Government Skills and Curriculum Unit, so couldn't be more topical and relevant, and currently COO of Civic Future, which is aiming to get the best possible people into public life, which I'm sure may well be a strand of what we want to discuss today. And finally, Dame Sue Owen, who, again, long history and experience in Whitehall and civil service. I got to know Sue in the Department for Work and Pensions when I was in there, and Sue was one of the Director Generals. We had an interesting time with IDS and all the universal credit and various welfare reforms that happened in the coalition. But then you, Sue, moved on to be Permanent Secretary at DCMS. So a really brilliant breadth of experience and different, I imagine slightly different perspectives, slightly different world views on what needs to happen and kind of where we are at the moment and how we move forward. So I'm going to start with the obvious question, which I want to pose to all three of you, if I can, which is, as I said at the start, we've had countless reviews, countless reports. There is, I would say, a very broad consensus of what the challenges are, what the shortcomings are. If we accept, which we all do, there are lots of fabulous elements to the civil service. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the things that need to improve, so we will lock that and accept it. But there are shortcomings, there are flaws that people frequently raise, and that could be about skills, it could be about diversity, it could be about short-termism, it could be about leadership. Why is it, though, when people frequently identify the same things, that we haven't seemingly had the progress? Is it actually because there is progress, but we just sort of haven't caught up with the fact that things have improved? Is it because the diagnosis is wrong? Is it because it's just so difficult to drive change in what is quite a fragmented, ultimately, system? Simone, you were deeply involved in, what probably has been in recent times the most impactful successful Whitehall reform period in those early coalition years. What's your sense of progress we've made, and why we haven't made as much progress as perhaps we'd like to?
It is the question to come to, and it's very interesting because most of the diagnoses are, as you say, the problems identified: too much churn, too many generalists, not enough sort of specific skills in project management or digital or whatever. All of these are identified as problems, and nobody actually disagrees on them either, which is sort of, but we do have to ask ourselves why we're going back to the time of Fulton report, while we're going back actually further. I found a report from 1921 where the same problems or similar were being identified, and you have to ask why is it so difficult to drive change? And I think where I've probably come out as one of the big problem is there's no one ultimately in charge of the stewardship of the civil service. And so, the Minister for the Civil Service is the Prime Minister. But the fact is that the Prime Minister is busy, and it's not concentrating on the day-to-day management and the long-term future of the civil service, but maintaining the capability to serve ministers, future governments, etc., is an incredibly important role. And these reforms that we're talking about are long-term reforms as well. They're not short, quick fix. So but essentially, I mean, occasionally there's been the head of the civil service, but all too frequently it's rolled into the role of the cabinet secretary. The cabinet secretary is actually really a role that is principal advisor to the Prime Minister, who who should be a brilliant policy official. But what you're asking him or her also to do is manage a change management program across sort of 400,000, 500,000 people. I mean, it's absurd. You wouldn't ask it in an ordinary organisation, and why are you asking for it here? And I could go into all the problems that it's a feudal structure. So you have, different departments, and the different departments all have very different ideas about how they might manage various reforms. So you can't get a sort of similar way of sort of managing everything. For example, in government digital, you should have a single standard format across the civil service. You cannot insist on that because every department is their own accounting officer, accountable to the chief accounting officer, the treasury, but they're not. The cabinet secretary or the head of the civil service haven't got the levers to drive the change either. So I think that where it has to come down, there has to be someone who is now empowered with the stewardship of the civil service and some way of holding that to account in a more long-term way, maybe through an empowered civil service commission or whatever, to be accountable to Parliament for the and take responsibility for the long-term skills.
Thank you. It's definitely a strong message that's been coming through the work we've been doing, that who is it that's actually responsible for the corporate health of this body. Pamela, you obviously were driving some of the reforms before you left, and in probably one of the areas that people have talked about the most around skills, leadership, some of the stuff that Simone has touched on there. What's your sense of progress that has been made, but also again, why we're still frustrated? We still, I think you put it to me before, everyone's still a bit grumpy. Why is that the case?
That is true. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for convenience. It's lovely to be in such a nice room full of friendly faces, as well as on such an august panel. Sorry, I was just saying it's so lovely to be able to look out into a room full of such friendly faces. And I will. Some of you have heard some of what I'm going to say before, and I'll apologise. The good thing about having no poker face and no filter is that people sort of become used to a certain level of ranting, and so I'll apologise in advance for that. But I had a quick look preparing for this. I had a quick look at the recent wave of reform papers. So we've had the brilliant work of reform. We've had policy exchanges, government reimagined. We've had the Smart to Government Commission. We've had a feast of Francis Wood reviews. We've had the government's own declaration of reform, and then scrutiny of that. and I did a bit of a not very scientific meta study of them all, and this is what I found. None of the problem analysis is any different really from what kicked off this most recent wave of reform, which was Michael Gove's Ditchley speech in summer 2020. It's all there, typically erudite and thorough. And all the recommendations of all the different reports, and indeed that speech he made, fall into three categories, with acknowledgements to John Boyd: people, ideas, technology. So on people, the general consensus is we need different people and better skilled people. So we need more competent and experienced people at a universal level, a higher standard of foundational skills, and then higher specialist and technical skills. And we can do that by changing people. Open recruitment, secondments, more career switching, or we can do it by developing people. Now I will come back to that because, as Charlotte said, it's the bit I feel most qualified to comment on. And on ideas, the recommendations tend to be the hardware or software, so structures or processes. Moving civil service out of London comes up, improving permanent secretary accountability, independent evaluation, more financial scrutiny, more financial transparency, the perennial favourite of more joined up task forces. We've seen that for the last 80 years or so, I think, in recommendations. On technology, that's everything from more automation of data collection, so that we can, do the sort of routine, predictable, high volume things better, to the more mundane, can we please have a pass that works on every government building? Laughably hard to achieve. So quick audit of the positive stuff. On data, genuinely, in health, in borders, in some of the trades teams, that a lot has been achieved with the help of a lot of people in this room, and particularly on the sort of descriptive and to an extent diagnostic level. It is very different from it was before 2019, and there is a reason that year is important, because those years between 2019 and now really exposed where we needed more resilient data. There's still a long way to go. We need to move from descriptive to diagnostic to predictive, but we have to celebrate that has happened. Digitalisation. If you listen to the Department for Work and Pensions, Neil Cooling described just how much more automated, more digital the universal credit and welfare payment system is, and making the standard aspects more routine, so that human beings can be freed up to do that really tricky stuff with families with multiple needs. It genuinely brings a patriotic tear to your eye. And as a quick digression, I found out in 2021 that a Canadian rock band had made a chart-topping hit about the Canadian equivalent of the DWP. So where is Ed Sheeran's song about Neil Cooling, is my question. Moving people out of London, just follow Beth Russell on LinkedIn, talking about the Darlington campus. It is a thing. It is recruiting people locally. It is forming close and deep links with local businesses, universities, etc. These are all positive things. But we're not here to discuss that, and there are massive problems still. And the biggest challenge, I think, and I don't, it's a safe space, and I think we should just acknowledge it. There has just been a collapse in mutual respect, trust, confidence between the politicos and the civil servants. It's just not been, that's the grumpiness, I think, Charlotte. And it is new. I mean, I'm a bit ancient, and I do remember, Blair Brown and the coalition, and those were tough times as well. But something is different now. But that's a consequence, it's not a cause, and the cause of that is manifold, but one of the reasons for it is that we haven't made enough progress on things like accountability. We still don't have hard enough performance measures for permanent secretaries, or anyone else, and people are still using the sort of opacity and HR gobbledygook of success profiles to decide their own performance, based on whatever abstract subjective fad is in fashion and performative posturing. That has to end. Other sectors do it well, the civil service can. And on skills, well, the people bit, that's everything, and that's where I can unleash, because I know a lot about this. I know exactly what was achieved and what wasn't, and how hard it was. There is a skills problem in the civil service. It needs a higher standard of knowledge and competence, particularly in precise things. Public finances, budgeting, science, languages, geopolitics, history, problem solving, data analysis. I said it needs specialist skills and specialist expertise in those things. People need to stop progressing in their career until they can prove that they have that expertise, by exams and external assessment if needed. everything we did to establish, from 2020 onwards, to establish the first ever curriculum for some of these precise measurable knowledge and skills. The campus for skills to deliver it on and offline, a leadership college that brought together the sort of alphabet spaghetti of courses that were going on, including use of a cabinet office building outside York for training that people seem to have forgotten existed, rather than expensive hotels, the College for National Security, higher quality apprenticeships, big improvements in fast stream induction and training, which really had lost its way to HR gobbledygook in the decade previously. Digital courses, universal induction, everything there was just the absolute minimum of what should have been a massive, massive revolution. All of those foundations, if properly realised, led well from the top, as Simone said, would transform the ideas and technology bit of people, ideas and technology, because you'd have alpha people in charge of them. And the impact, sorry, Charlotte, one more thing, the impact of a more skilled, confident, competent, high-performing civil service, always striving to learn more and achieve more within a deservedly proud, deservedly hierarchical institution that transmits wisdom and experience and virtue ethics through the generations, makes new recruits aspire to be great, an elite institution but not elitist, where anyone from anywhere can know what it is they need to know and do to progress. The impact of that would be incredible. It would be like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore in the 60s. So why didn't we achieve the skills reforms? Why was everything so exhaustingly hard? Why was every incremental change so hard won? Because of ministerial change and lack of money? No, not all. As I say, I remember Blair Brown, I remember the coalition, ministerial churn and absence of resources is not a new thing. I think the real problem is that this interest in people and the human capital of a workforce, to build on Simone's point about stewardship, sits in corporate HR. And it shouldn't. It's too important for that. Everyone from Max Weber to Christopher Hood to Patrick Dunleavy to Adrian Wooldridge's brilliant book from a couple of years ago to Juliet Samuel, more recently brilliantly, as pointed out, you cannot have something that important sitting with a quite insecure profession, pseudo-scientific discipline, all going through some form of replication crisis, oddly credentialed, ideologically captured, unimaginative, race to the bottom. You cannot have, I feel quite strongly about this, you cannot have something as important as your people being held by that bit of the system. So if you do one thing, change that, take it away from Civil's HR, possibly take it out of the Cabinet Office. I think by any metric at the moment, the Cabinet Office ought to be on special measures.
We'll move on to that bombshell, which actually, again, in the work we've been doing, that, I mean, both of you now talked about the centre, where's the ownership of this agenda, is it functioning? We had one quote from someone who said the Cabinet Office was the most dysfunctional organisation that they'd ever come across. And I don't think it's necessarily because of the people, right? It's because of the. There you go.
Those are brilliantly run.
Yeah, exactly. You can definitely demand things in a way you can't have permanent secretaries, which is a brilliant segue to Sue.
Okay, so
can I also ask you within it, because obviously you have the permanent secretary perspective. You will have sat in Wednesday colleagues meetings. You will have been part of. You led. I think you were one of the champions for diversity. With that hat on, why is it so hard?
well, I'll say a few things. So actually, while Simone was talking, it reminded me of a little vignette I will tell you about that I'd forgotten about. And the first time I met Frances Lord with Simone was when I became a Plum Sack in 2013. And I was just going off in the morning, and my husband, who's a lot older than me, 18 years older than me, and he's a sociologist, said, "Oh, what are you doing today?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'm going to meet Frances Lord for the first time." I said, "Oh, I think I've got a book by his father." So goes to the huge library at home and pulls out this book by, I think it was Angus Lord, which was written in the mid-1950s. And it was basically a rant about the civil service and the lack of professionalism. And so I think the book was called Professionals. I'm not sure, I should have checked it up. Anyway, one of the things, so I took it to the meeting, and Frances signed it. So I was his friend forever there. So it was lucky we got that book. Anyway, one of the gripes he had was how the sort of finances of the civil service were usually done by people who'd done Greek and Latin. And so that was actually very interesting because some things have been professionalised and changed. So in the last 20 years, you do have to have finance directors who are properly qualified as accountants. Obviously, we've had good lawyers all along. And even in my lifetime, when I started at the Treasury in 1989, economists were beginning to move into policy jobs. They weren't just the people sort of in the ivory tower doing the forecast. And we then had a series of economists who became permanent secretary of the Treasury. And so that kind of moving of people like that into the more policy jobs was a very good thing. And personally, I think that needs to happen now with scientists and so on. But really, and I agree with a lot of what Simone said, you do need a period of stability to do some reform, and we haven't had that recently. There's been a lot of chopping and changing of ministers and so on. And wholesale reform will require some money, and the Treasury are never there willing to do that. So, when I was at DWP with you, I had something like 1,500 people. And after the cuts, it was still 1,000 people. When I went to DCMS, I had 350 with a much wider range of topics and so on. But I could have done my DWP job with 300 people. But to move another 700 out and pay the remaining 300 more always costs too much money. So it's always a too difficult box for the Treasury. So I think it needs to be very committed and brave set of ministers and senior civil servants to actually do that. Having said that, I think John Manzoni did achieve a lot in the Cabinet Office, and he did professionalise commercial and procurement. You can't work in commercial now unless you pass an exam. And we've probably saved the taxpayer a shed load of money on better procuring. Project management has gotten better as well. And I would say we're kind of only on the road with digital and data. But again, we've been paying those people more. So I think the money side of it is really, really important.
And I do want to pick up on the PermSec role as well. Because we've sort of heard or kind of different degrees of force or kind of implying that PermSecs themselves can be a blocker in the system. So we've heard this really strongly from former PermSecs who've said to us, the most common response from permanent secretaries to the centre saying this is the new change programme is eye rolling. I mean, I literally think the phrase eye roll was the most common thing we heard from our interviews. And I'm sure, that was very much not you at DCMS, just battling the Treasury, which is another very common theme that we heard as well. But how do you get to a point, given the scale of the system, given the fiefdom model, given that actually a lot of PermSecs are from policy backgrounds rather than operational or having delivery experience, and change programs require an understanding of implementation and they're really challenging? What is the role of the PermSecs in this, and what was your experience when a change program would be announced from the centre?
Well, if you write down a list of what does the permanent secretary do, there are 4 or 5 things, and one of them is to be the personal and policy advisor to the Secretary of State and have a good relationship with that person. And another is to be a civil service leader. And yes, I did a lot of stuff on diversity. I was the champion of all of that. But it's never in your own minister's interests that you spend all your time or a huge amount of time on civil service reform or whatever. So, ministers have got their own jobs to do, and they're all very ambitious to get their own policies in and so on. So it's never in any individual minister's interest for all that to happen. I mean, obviously someone like Francis, that was their job. They were the minister for the Cabinet Office, but nobody else was particularly interested in that. Just like, it's very difficult always doing policy that's cross-cutting, because ministers are always competing with each other too. So I think, again, that's where I think longer periods of stability, where the Permanent Secretary might be more prepared to delegate to the people who actually really know what they're doing policy-wise, and to spend more time on the civil service reform. I mean, I think Gus was quite good at that, to be honest.
Well, he had Jeremy Hayward doing a lot of the kind of day-to-day PM advisory role as well.
That's right.
So that kind of
That's
double head.
That's right.
Thank you. And I want to pick up, so you mentioned John Manzoni there, who obviously was brought in from outside. Another common observation that is made is that a lot of the people who get to the top have only ever experienced the civil service, and so it's difficult to know how you would do something differently if you've never experienced something different. And people always say we need a more porous system. That's another common thing that comes up. We need more external experience. Simone, this is one of the things that France really did do in terms of the functions and bringing in external people. Have we got to a good place on that?
We've got to an interesting place on that actually, and I think we have to show some credit back, absolutely where it's due, which is that that France realised that you needed to have cross-cutting functions within government. When the government digital service was set up, for example, the idea was to have a common gov.uk website domain, that you'd close down thousands of different websites that existed, that and that you would have common standards across government. Now, some of that, ditto with procurement, making it more commercial. That's been a success. Doesn't mean it can't necessarily be improved. But the problem is, and the fact that the functions are established and everyone accepts that they are there now and they're there to stay, means that they must be the right way to go. The way that the functions were envisaged was that they should be a small area of expertise at the centre. So you were meant to have, they weren't meant to be huge, burgeoning areas in their own right. They were meant to be, so as the government digital service was set up at the beginning, with Mike Bracken, that you can recruit people who really know what they're doing, you can train them up, you can basically go out and choose your own. So that the centre was meant to have good leadership, proper leadership, which is vital. It was meant to have proper capability so that they would be turned to for expert advice. They were not meant to replicate the function within the department necessarily, because obviously the Home Office will have its own digital service or whatever. And I'm using digital as an example, and there were several functions. But the problem was that most of the functions lack a mandate across Whitehall, though this is always the case, that you can't tell other departments how to do it. So I remember the great department of Biz decided that they weren't going to use the same technology as GTS was recommending. So they did an entirely new system. So you can't actually, it's still in Whitehall now, do a Zoom meeting because it's all on Teams and vice versa. When I got to number 10, I was told I couldn't have an Apple computer. And since I've never used Microsoft, I said, well, I've got a problem. So I got one. But it was sort of, come on, this was years ago we recommended this. So the lack of a clear mandate has not necessarily worked, and they have got too big. They're not meant to be huge mini departments. And part of the dysfunction of the Cabinet Office is that the Cabinet Office is composed of all these secretariats that support, quite rightly, the Prime Minister's office. And then they've got all these cross-government functions that actually should really be sitting out with. They should be sitting at the centre. But it's very easy to confuse all the finance work of the Cabinet Office with the finance work at the centre. It's very, very confusing. And so I think they're a very good idea. I think they need to be sharper.
Gosh, something being set up in government and then just expanding. Who would have thought it? Exactly.
Yeah.
Just come in on the recruiting from outside.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
And
And sorry, because I wanted to ask you as well, Pamela, which I think links to that, which is this question of kind of cognitive diversity and kind of, I think Claire Moriarty a while back called it singleton oddities. You know, how do you enable those, or Dom Cummings's weirdos and misfits type thing? But how do you create a system that both will attract them in, but then actually will enable them to be the innovators in the system, rather than making them become the sort of, I guess, stereotypical bureaucrat that we have.
And that's a crucial thing. So I went back and read Catherine Baxendale's report from 2015 about what actually happens when people, you know, career switch in. And one of the unexpected things that has happened with Civic Future. So I won't promote it too much, but you know, the sort of flagship thing, the fellowship and early stage, you know, strategic bet early on in people's careers in terms of, you know, building a sort of wider and deeper talent pool for public life. But one of the things that happened was a load of people got in touch with us after we launched who were at the other end of their career, possibly radicalised by the last couple of years watching government in action. But you know, they've made their career in finance or tech or the arts or something completely different, never thought about policy in public life, and suddenly thought, well, you know, I'm at a place in my life where I do want to do something, you know. And you know, when you've worked inside the system, you're able to reel off all the different ways, non-executive, executive, appointed, elected, etc. When you're outside, you know, it's just a mad Byzantine mess, isn't it? Anyway, Catherine Baxter's report, it could have been written yesterday. All of these things, that's the interesting thing about all the recommendations in these reports, they can all be done. You can appoint external people, you can advertise externally, you can all be done. The problem is that they're not being used. So why is that? You know, in a lot of bureaucracy, it's the practice that's interesting. The first thing to say is, it is not always the case that because someone's in the private sector, they are a better candidate. You know, if you're a sort of, you know, mid-manager in a bank, why are you necessarily a better person to be doing something in a large complex bureaucracy like sometimes you might be, but you know, I think this sort of crude presumption that, you know, the outside is always better is you know, insulting and just untrue. But when you do, a system is better when people, you know, sorry, I'm digressing a bit, but all the graduate streams, teach first and then everything that came from that, the one for the police, the prison service, it wasn't the case that, you know, only a graduate could go in and do that job. What they really did was give a different sort of hierarchy and network to a group of people into what had been a slightly industrial, closed workforce. So when you bring external people into an organisation, that's what you're doing. You're bringing people in who have a bigger professional hinterland, get their status from different places, have knowledge, skills and networks from different places, and that's what's really rich. So a couple of things happen. People apply for the job and they understand all the words being used in the job description, but they don't necessarily understand them in that order, or they don't understand the euphemisms at the civil service. I mean, that's a conversation. A lot of the time I help people informally with job descriptions, and that is just sort of like I know what the word policy means. What do they mean by it? And it's so sort of being that kind of interpreter. And that happens again in every sector, but being an interpreter and just sort of giving people that's sort of smoothing the ice for people when they first enter this baffling place. You know, I was watching Phil Rycroft and Jonathan Slater's session here with you, and I think it was Jonathan who talked about Sam Friedman's work on sociability, the class ceiling, and that's one of the things. It's in navigating the language of a set. And I actually disagree with Jonathan. I think if you don't understand the classical illusion, you should look it up. It's never been easier. Every day's a learning day, Jonathan. But you know, and similarly, when you go and work in a prison, you know, learning that when something kicks off in front of you, you should look behind you. You know, this is places become more accessible to work in when you learn, but you need a mentor, you need a coach, you need a manager who's interpreting it for you. So I think it would be much easier if we were specific and transparent about the actual skills, not the euphemisms and kind of platitudes, and then supported people with a sort of brief period of induction. And I had a lot of Dom's geeks and weirdos in my teams in various ways, and that's all I did. They were brilliant people. They needed to understand how the system worked.
Which comes back to your HR point of how we actually develop people and think about the fact that our biggest asset is the people in the system and how do we enable them to do great things. So I wanted to pick up some points. I do want to open to questions soon. But I mean, if you have any thoughts on the kind of bringing external people in, brilliant. But I guess I wanted to pick up on this recent debate around the politicisation and kind of where the line sits. And a few people we've spoken to have commented on the fact that actually the civil service is not non-political. You know, it's actually not neutral, but it should be apolitical and impartial. And they're quite important distinctions because ultimately the civil service is there to serve the administration of the day, which by definition is political. And it feels like we've kind of got ourselves all sort of slightly tied up in knots around those relationships. And Pamela talked about some of the kind of perhaps less trusting or kind of, more grumpy relationships currently. And I just wondered, so your reflections on the role of the civil service in a political environment but needing to be apolitical themselves and how you build those strong relationships between ministers
I
and
don't
officials.
think it's very difficult actually. I mean, civil service values honesty and integrity and impartiality and being objective and evidence-based and all of that. And obviously these roles are political because you're working with politicians. What you don't do is impart your personal political views, and if you can't hack that, you shouldn't be in the civil service. So I think it's absolutely crucial that the Secretary of State of the day feels your baton from them. And if a permanent secretary hasn't got that relationship, it really isn't going to work. And you have to build that differently with every different Secretary of State you have, because they're people and they're different. And you have to find out, what is going to work for them and how we can really help them best. And obviously there's some things. I mean, appointments. Simone and I did a lot of appointments together. I think it's perfectly reasonable that the politicians of the day should be able to field some candidates that they have asked to field. What has to happen though is those people have to pass the
standard. Yeah.
And I always said, I'm very happy to interview those people, but they have to do the homework for the job and show they can do the job. So I don't think the civil service is full of lefties, and I really don't. Just a quick word on the misfits. I think the key thing with the misfits is not to put them into the structure, to find a way of supporting them for their particular expertise. And maybe, I managed a misfit, who Jeremy Haywood. Jeremy was a very good disruptor, actually. He saw the value of some of these people. And I deliberately did not give this person anybody to manage. I gave them, some people to help. But then they reported to me and were able then just to have kind of big ideas. And of course, the misfits don't always get on with each other either. So actually, we had some very brilliant people in the GDS that didn't actually particularly get on with each other, but we did make some progress there. And sometimes you have some misfit ministers. You can't really get on with anybody else. And if you have a minister who can't really get on with civil servants, like Gordon Brown couldn't really, you find a way around that. And when I was doing the 5 tests of whether we should join the Euro, we never had a meeting with Gordon. We always had the meetings with Ed Balls and Gus O'Donnell, and then they had the meetings with him, and that worked extremely well.
You find your hand in.
So you have to be quite flexible and kind of go with the flow of the brilliant person that you are.
And except that's why you brought them in, right?
Exactly.
So don't try and clamp it down. How many you want to come in and
Just really quickly, because I'm not completely happy with this sort of depiction of there's the normal boring old civil servants, and then there's these like cool radical misfits over here. And, some of the most.
I don't think they were cool.
No, do you know what I mean? This kind of really sort of clear dichotomy, because some of the people that have come in, through appointments or in the sort of ever expanding kind of entourage around ministers at the moment. Again, it's a consequence, not a cause of what's going on. Pretty staid in terms of the way they're thinking, not in the least bit radical or imaginative or creative or specialist in their knowledge. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. And in the civil service, there are the most amazing kind of radical thinkers, neurodiverse, etc., etc. So it's not, I don't think there's one answer to that, Sue. I think some people, I agree with you, don't let them anywhere near people management, contain, this is where you're going to add the most value. But I'd say that about quite a lot of civil service, to be honest. Some of the nicest sociopaths I've met. On the other hand, someone like Charlie Taylor, for example, was an outsider who was brought in, not a misfit if Charlie's watching, great man, but he completely got it. He just fit in here, and he wouldn't have been effective if he hadn't had actual levers, because the frustration of some of the good people from the outside is they've been asked to come in and do a job, but they can't make the machine work. So you have to give them a bit of the machine, otherwise they can't.
Which I think is also similar actually for those people who are in the service, already in the civil service, who actually could be really innovative, but the process and the structure don't allow you to do it. So.
Which is actually, funny enough, it's exactly the point that I wanted to go to, especially on the Catherine Baxendale report, where there was some, quite astonishing quotes. Pamela's just reminded me. But one of them was that you're brought in, and it's finding the levers to be able to do everything, because they're so worried about the process that the patient dies, and that they felt as though they were treated like the sort of the members of the country club that had been brought in and welcomed on a sort of short-term basis. And the other quote was that the door, I found finally where the door opens, it only opens from the inside. So I think that there is a certain way of managing. To go, I completely agree with what Sue said on the political impartiality point. Civil servants are required to act in a politically impartial way. That doesn't mean they're not supposed to be human beings who may possibly have their own views, but as long as those don't filter through to how they are implementing the policies of the ministers that are serving, I see absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think some of this faux outrage of the appointment of Sue Gray has been appalling. I really do. And it's Sue, I worked with Sue Gray a lot, and I have never had one moment to question her political impartiality, and she absolutely implemented some of France's reforms that I'm sure she didn't like very much. Anyway, but I think it's the ability to act in a politically impartial way, and to be passionate about what you're doing, but you're not neutral and independent, and I'm glad you brought that.
Perfect. Okay, I promise I would open up to questions. So many different aspects we could touch on, lots we haven't even touched on yet. So I'm going to take three, if I can ask you, as we are slightly short of time, to keep it to a short question, that would be fantastic.
Yes, Hitan Shah from the British Academy. With general election coming up and no money for the next government, it's a kind of opportunity for reform. So interested in your kind of views on how we shape a narrative for that, and also in particular with the interest in AI, technology and data, how that agenda might play out.
Thank you. And I think it was someone
Greg Rosen, Senior Counsel at St Newgate, former Consultant Director of Reform, where I was lucky enough to co-write 3 reports advocating reform of civil service, largely echoing Simone, the work that you did, and mostly not implemented as per what you described. What is to stop the politicians who are currently running this country reaching out to those in other parties to try and get cross-party reform of the civil service on a government-backed basis? There are obviously some cross-party initiatives outside government, and there is good work that government has been doing to try and do it. But given the importance of impartiality of the civil service, the criticism of those who advocate reform is always to try to criticise it. Surely a cross-party approach is working.
And we'll take one more if anyone has. Yeah, gentleman here.
Elliot Wilson, I was a clerk in the House of Commons for 11 years. So I just wanted to ask, particularly to what Simone said about accountability. What about the accountability of the civil service directly to Parliament? Does that need to be improved, or does it still go through ministers? Or?
Brilliant. Great questions. Thank you. So I'm going to ask a relatively brief answer so we can get through some more questions. But the first one, I guess, I'm going to pose to everyone. So election coming up, no money, might well get a change of government. isn't that an opportunity, and what is the opportunity? And also particularly thinking about, I guess, maybe in the context of no money, but how can we use AI more impactfully? I mean, you picked up on the data side of stuff, which is crucial to be able to use AI. So if I start with you on that.
Well, I don't think it's an opportunity at all, because we've just been talking about how we actually need money to do quite a bit of reform, and an incoming government will be wanting to get on with its own agenda, or continue its agenda if it's the current government. I think there is quite a lot of mileage in AI for doing a lot of routine things. It's got to be managed quite carefully, but I think that, I mean, if you think of things like, the court service or something like that, even in prisons, actually, you could use AI to predict when you might be going to get a riot or whatever, if you were able to kind of use the data properly.
We do use loads of we've automated quite a lot of processes. We have in the prison and court systems, awash with data. The issue, I think, is more that human beings know how to interpret and use that data for decision making. So I do think, to Ethan's point, I do think that I've been playing around on ChatGPT like everyone. I mean, it is amazing how quickly it can write a very good speech for a minister. And if civil servants aren't recognising how they can save time by doing that, then they should. However, as we've been discussed in many ways, there's built-in biases to AI. There's whether you actually want your most junior team member not to be applying their brain, but to be just typing things into ChatGPT, and whether that person then goes on to be effective in the career. So definitely routine, predictable, high volume tasks. Automate as many as you can. In Wandsworth Prison, there was about 10 people doing compensation submissions by hand. Prisoners are quite litigious and they've got a lot of time in their hands, and things get lost between cells, and that can all be automated. So that, but it doesn't mean fewer people. What it means is people who can really do the hard work in prison. So it's it definitely needs some thought, but it's like all these things, we're overestimating the impact in the short term and probably underestimating it in the long term. I do think too.
I just want to go
on the AI question. Okay, I mean on AI very quickly.
I guess maybe the opportunity as well.
There is always an opportunity with new technology and the lack of money that just sort of really spurred on the idea we need to digitise services, because it's 50 times cheaper to do something digitally than it is to have a face-to-face meeting, 20 times cheaper than it was to do a telephone call. So it is a spur. So that could be, but we need to watch out for the dangers. And there is a Centre for Data Ethics in DCMS that seems to have fallen into disuse, and I think we need to be very aware of how we're monitoring it as well.
Yeah. And then the second question was about cross-party reform of civil service, and I wonder whether there's a link to the accountability to Parliament actually, and if people were more conscious of the challenges and opportunities and what civil service did, and there was more accountability to Parliament, where there maybe would be more impetus to create that cross-party drive. So maybe we can take those two questions together. Who would like to pick that up first?
I'm very happy just in terms of...
well, as one of you would scrutinise if it was coming to Parliament, seeing as you said it was.
True. But in terms of accountability to Parliament, civil servants do the accountability through the PAC as accounting officers to Parliament. But the traditional approach is always that the minister is accountable to Parliament, the civil service is accountable to the minister. Therefore, the minister has got to feel confident in how their department is operating, and that's part of the deal with making sure the civil service has the skills and capability to serve the minister adequately, because they're not going to be doing the day-to-day management. Now, in terms of, I talked about a stewardship agenda, I think the cross-party element is vital, because there's always a danger of screaming politicisation if ministers start to have their quite legitimate role actually in appointments to the civil service or whatever. If you can make sure that sitting on bodies that monitor these things, that there are people from both parties, then I think that could act as quite a strong safeguard to the charge of politicisation. Most of our reforms that we brought in with Francis were done with the support of the Labour Party, and we couldn't have achieved as much. And the Lib Dems were obviously in government with us. So we could. I mean, I do remember when we had a massive round that went on for about 3 years about whether the Prime Minister should be allowed a choice of candidates for permanent secretary. Whether, rather than being presented with one candidate at the end of the process, there could be those who were deemed appointable, i.e. capable and politically impartial. And this went on forever until we realised that, until Michael Duggar sort of came out and said, actually, we totally support what Francis Ford is trying to do. He's a bull in a china shop. We'll obviously have a much nicer approach, but we agree with all his reforms, and we agree particularly with this. At which point everyone went, well, we can't really hold out any longer. So anyway.
And it's funny the fact that it's in the interest of all parties, because if you think people get into government, don't you want to see
that's
those
always
capable?
but
So
believe me, they
exactly.
they were very helpful.
There's a
The Labour Party was
self-motivation,
helpful then, yes.
self-interest.
Yeah.
Well, the first to remember, we haven't talked about it much today, so maybe it's the subject of another panel, but the subject of a lot of these reports, and indeed, Michael Gove's dictionary speech, it wasn't just about the civil service. There are questions for ministers and secretary of states and junior ministers and all of this. It's a sort of government reform and the talent pool and the preparedness of SPADs, PADs, non-executive board members, and again, that is something that one of the sort of driving principles of Civic PhD. So it's not just the civil service; it's the whole system. I think clearly it is good if things are cross-party. I'd be a bit hesitant about a sort of royal commission and another report to add to the pile of reports we've just said, because as we're concluding, it is not the what that's a problem here; it's the how and the who of implementation. And another nice thing, which I think comes up a lot of panels like these and at the IFG and in some of the work that Civic PhD will do, is just how much wisdom there is that's just left the system. So whether it's former Prime Secs or former ministers and Secretary of States, I enjoy William Hague's columns in the Times on foreign policy because he has huge perspective and wisdom and time and capacity. And we're quite bad at using that. So I think there is something in. Former ministers, John Hutton wrote a brilliant book with his permanent secretary about the civil service. There's so much wisdom still around that if we harnessed it in some way, but again, focus on the how and the who, not the what. We know the what, so just get it done. And finally, on accountability, I think it was Philip and Jonathan who said as well, that the thing that the current secretary are most terrified is the Public Accounts Committee. But because of the way things have been, and we should come back on the conversation on the functions, Simone, because I think some of them are great and some of them are, have been less successful. But because of the functions, perm secs have been slightly infantilized, so they can't talk about stuff that's been sort of hived off to the centre. Whereas if they were clearly directly responsible for the skills, knowledge, networks of their people, the performance of their people, the management of their ship of state, that then the kind of hard and soft incentive of parliamentary accountability would be a lot more meaningful as a tool.
Which actually is complementary, I think, to Simone's point about the centre was only ever supposed to be as a supportive, almost a kind of consultancy, kind of enabler function. So in that model, the perm sec would still be responsible. But the Cabinet Office is 6,000 odd more people over the last 5-6 years. So, Sue, cross-party accountability, you would have been hauled up, I'm sure, in front of various.
Yeah, I think this system works quite well actually, and certainly the Public Accounts Committee system works quite well. You are responsible for the finances. Yeah. And of course, that's where you may have to disagree with your minister, and you can seek a direction on value for money grounds and that kind of thing, and the directions are published each year, and probably that's a good thing, to be able to do that. I'm actually still in touch with quite a lot of my former ministers who do actually ask my view on things.
There we go, so it's positive. I'm going to do one. I'm conscious we are only a few minutes away from when we're so at the end. We did start a couple of minutes late, so hopefully people bear with me, but I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then we will wrap up at that point. Yeah, very back, and then two gentlemen at the back. They got their hands up fastest.
James Pamela, my experience is basically private sector. The question is, or the observation is somebody who tried to drive change through large private sector organisation. You talked about it's not about the what, it's about the how. My experience of most resistance, and believe me, there's plenty of resistance to change in the private sector as well, particularly people who think they're doing good and have got in habits that actually they believe that doing something important, is about the why. and actually showing people why this is sufficiently important to shift it in priorities. Does that resonate?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Aldridge. I want to ask a question about whether civil service reform alone is enough. So what I think of is civil service is what 10% of the public sector, public services. If we want to radically reform and improve our public services, for example, shifting resources from treating problems to preventable happening, if we want to accelerate the dissemination and diffusion of innovation across public services, if we want to sharpen incentives for performance of public services, don't we need a reform to the civil service that's embedded in a wider reform of public services?
Great questions, thank you. So first questions, is it actually about the why? And again, that's the thing that does come up. How do you convince? How do you create purpose, motivation? Build movements that are going to embrace change. And the second question was, is actually focusing on the civil service in the sense of Whitehall just too narrow, and shouldn't that just be part of a broader public services reform agenda, which would enable, for the example we got was from all the spending going on crisis and none going on prevention, and you can't do that by reforming the civil service. And I think you probably could do some of it, but reflections on that.
So I do some private sector things now, and I have to say I don't see the quality of the people there being that much better, or indeed better at all. But it is easier to do things because it's shareholders at the end of the day, and they generally, if they've got a good reason for doing something, can throw money at it and do it, and so it is easier. I totally agree that it's not just the civil service. The rest of the public sector needs to change as well. But there are some interesting things going on there. Just thinking my old world, that we've got all the arm's length bodies and that kind of thing. Appointing someone to run the Natural History Museum who used to run Amazon. Brilliant appointment. Really can get some good expertise in there. But the engagement with public service is mostly not the civil service.
I think the why is a really, sorry, I forgot your name, but that's a really, really interesting question. There's others in this room, we've had conversations about this. I'm looking at Josh's back. There's an obvious answer to the why, which I hear from a lot of colleagues and friends and people I mentor in the private sector, which is it's a gift to do the why in government. You're running the country. You're making it. You're making it easier for people feeling public services aren't just a nice have, they're a dependency to make their life better. I mean, it's hard not to make the hairs on people at the back of his neck stand up when you're talking about what government can do for good. But I think it is a slightly different why for civil service public sector than it is for the politicians, and that's why the sort of symbiotic relationship, again, that's Josh's phrase, not mine, between the ministers and the civil servants is really important, because I think we made a bit of a mistake in making some of the big recruitment campaigns about the issues. So, the fast stream recruitment rounds for the last couple of years have been, do you want to work on climate change? Do you want to work on homelessness? Now that is, you can see why the agencies came up with that, but actually that can be kind of misleading, because that's not the thing. That might be a really interesting, everyone loves working on an exciting bit of policy and achieving something together. But the thing that you need to get right in terms of the rhetoric for civil service recruitment is liberal democracies need really, really excellent institutions. And in that, if you're a part of that institution, you will be protecting democracy. You will be working on great things, but it's about democratic governments and strong institutions. If you are interested in climate change activism, go and join an NGO. You will be happier there. It's a slightly different why, but the why is there for the taking. It's so much more interesting working in government than it is in. I'm not going to name a company because that'd be rude. Enter your own.
But it is interesting that again people talk about government being the home for the clever people, and then people go, we just need different clever people, and it's not really about focusing on, okay, but you're going to come in and you might be interested in climate change, but you're going to be working on this bit of it, and you really need to be good at the delivery and the implementation and making it work rather than the big ideas. But we always focus on the big ideas part, and that's probably why we have a massive status gap between policy and ideas, and actually the people doing the hard graft.
Although the intellectual challenge
Very
of saying,
briefly,
the intellectual challenge of saying, I understand that these people are in cabinet, because they came into public service to make a difference. They may have, let's find a thin consensus that we agree with here in terms of equality of opportunity and making the country a great place, whatever it is. The intellectual challenge of finding your way to say, well, that might not be my approach to preventing people from making the dangerous and illegal journey across continents to travel across the channel in a small dinghy, but I know how to make this argument, and I will do my very best to try and work out, give the advice, whatever it might be. That's an intellectual challenge for policy people as well.
Yeah, no, I agree.
My point on the why would be very simply that if we're not constantly trying to improve something, it's pretty much standing still, and that's not acceptable. We should always be trying to find ways to make everything better. And one of the problems that I have is that those civil servants who would be prepared to take risks, and they went wrong, suffered for them, and they shouldn't, because those people are prepared to do something differently and new and innovative to try and improve something should be rewarded. Whereas those who sat and presided over the status quo stay out of trouble and often benefit. So I think the why is simply if we're not trying to make it better, then what are we doing? And on wider public services, yes, of course. This was about civil service, but of course the ideas and should flow through and be part of that.
And just as a thank you so much, and just as a reflection, Stephen, on that kind of, I guess the reason we chose as our starting point, we're a public services think tank, so we're passionate about everything within public services working as brilliantly as it possibly can do for all the reasons we've heard, which is that it can transform lives, right? That people are dependent on all of these things. What an incredible honour to work in one of these institutions to help people. But ultimately, the decisions made in Whitehall, whether that's about how to spend the money, the policies that are going to be implemented, the priorities of the government, will have a massive knock-on impact throughout all of those public services. So for us, trying to get that centre bit right, then it hopefully enables you to be making good decisions and flowing that reform out into public services. So slight justification for why we've chosen and why, as someone said today, we're talking particularly about this part of reform. But of course, you're right that the whole system, and I think you can look around those parts of the public sector today and say they're in need of quite a significant overhaul. So it's a great question. What a brilliant discussion. I feel like we could have covered so many other. We didn't even really get into risk aversion, which we touched on at the end, a massive problem in the civil service. But honestly, that's been fantastic. I'm sure everyone will go away having heard something which provoked another thought, kind of challenged a thought they had, or perhaps reinforced a lot of the things you're already thinking about, which is fine as well. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. You have been fantastic, as I expected. Thank you all for joining us. We have run a couple of minutes over. There will be tea, coffee and biscuits outside if anyone wants to network or continue the conversation. We'll talk about something entirely different. But thank you so much for joining us. If you do have thoughts or ideas, you want to get involved in our Reimagining Whitehall programme, please do get in touch. James, who is sitting here, and Simone, who is sitting there, are leading that programme. So please do talk to us. We'd love to hear more thoughts, more ideas. The kind of more people involved, the better, because as we've heard, there are lots of challenges which we do need to work out how we deliver a better system rather than the kind of what which we see today. So if we could just thank our panellists for the usual.